Greetings, everybody. David Danto here with BC Strategies. I'm on with Kevin Kieller, who's the owner of BC Strategies. Do I call you the owner? Do I call you the founder? Yeah,
I would say I'm leading BC Strategies, and,
leader of
and that's
BC
like
Strategies.
herding cats. It's like
Herding
an
cat.
elite group of people and with great opinions, but we have divergent opinions, which is the real strength of BC Strategies. I got back from Comes vNext at 4 a.m., and I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but this is the scruffy version of Kevin.
You'll look fine, Kevin. I don't have any issues with that. We're all. I'm the king of scruffy.
There you
No,
go.
so we are talking about Comes vNext, which is a show that I haven't been to before. You just got back from it, and I wanted to get your impressions for the people that follow the UC space as to what it's all about, because not everybody goes there. It's primarily a Microsoft show. But before I cut you off, why don't you tell everybody your impression? What's the definition of the Comes vNext? I know there's one in Europe and there's one in the US, and you just got back from the one in Denver in the US, correct?
That is correct. So, Comfy Next is 100%. It's a community event. It's focused on the Microsoft Teams ecosystem. It is held. This was my second year attending. I think it's been around for 5 years, but I've only been there for two. Um, it's in Denver, Colorado, at the Renaissance Denver Hotel and Conference Center, and it really, focuses and leans in on being an in-person event. They record all the sessions, which I think is great, and they make them available, but they intentionally choose not to make it a hybrid event because they really value kind of the in-person experience. There's probably about 350 people. Um, Huge props to Josh Blaylock, Jonathan McKinney, Adam Ball, Pat Richard, who are all Microsoft MVPs. And if you're not in the Microsoft ecosystem, that's a special designation that Microsoft gives to Microsoft most valuable professionals. These are people that are super smart and, outside of being smart and helping organizations, they spend time helping other people by either running events or speaking or writing. So this is a really unique kind of hardcore community event focused on, Microsoft and specifically Microsoft communication and collaboration, which means Teams, but of course now means you'll love this, David. It means AI, which means Microsoft Copilot.
Right. Well, it was interesting. I saw obviously a number of people were posting from the show and doing some things,
Right.
and they had this wall of names. They had all of the attendees, or is it all the MVPs? But most of the people that were there were pointing to their name on the board, which is beautiful for a sense of community, but also points to the fact that it's probably a pretty teeny show if it'll fit on one board.
Yeah, yeah, as I said, I mean it's like 350 people, but it's a focused experience, right? Like I know we've talked about Enterprise Connect, which is all the vendors and all the analysts, which is wonderful as well, but this is focused, but the key thing is it's not a vendor event. So it's a focused community, so it's all kind of focused on, Microsoft. Now, there was two exceptions to that. There was Patrick Kelly from Zoom, who's the distinguished architect from Zoom, and he did a session that was about how Zoom integrates with Microsoft Teams, which was fantastic. Patrick, he did a great job. He did lots of live demos. And of course, conference Wi-Fi is terrible. So he was hotspotting to his phone and doing live demos. And then, I was in Patrick's session. And then immediately after that, I had a session that was talking about the different AI assistants, right? So those two sessions, and Patrick was kind enough to join me, and and he attended my session, and hopefully I did as good a job he did. But those two really kind of talked a little broader than Microsoft, but for the most part, most of the sessions, were focused on obviously the Microsoft ecosystem.
Yeah, and as long as you brought it up, I'll try and put a link here on the screen when I put this together. Patrick Kelly's been on the show on UC Weekly News before, talking about the way you would integrate Zoom and Microsoft. He does a really good job with that. And if you haven't bought his
He
cookbook,
does.
you take a look at that. But in any case, so it was exciting for those two things. There were vendor stands. I assume that's how the bills get paid. Tell me about who the vendors were that participated in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, there was, and I had great conversations, and this is what it's all about, right? It's like great conversations. So, like Matt Landis, who is the president or CEO of Landis Technologies, they've got, Microsoft Contact Center and that and an automated assistant kind of thing, attendant. They were one of the kind of lead sponsors, as was a call cabinet, which has call recording and analytics and stuff. There was audio codes that has, you know, they've been around for a long time. SBCs, devices, contact center, some AI stuff. Rick Garcia from Momentum, they were also one of the lead sponsors. And Rick runs a phenomenal kind of evening event where he gets like all these paparazzi, like you get to pretend you're a superstar. He gets all these photographers and takes a whole bunch of people out to a great dinner. So that was for Momentum. Scipio, who has some unique PSTN kind of connectivity. And let me just think if I got everybody. I think that those were all the lead sponsors. But on top of it, there was Shure, which you're very familiar with, like very high-end audio that now has, big presence in Microsoft certified devices. Barco, which I believe you may be going to Belgium in May to see some of their ClickShare devices. Um, Algo, which are showing off some paging devices, because when you bring Microsoft Teams, like kind of the low-hanging fruit was knowledge workers, but when you bring it into manufacturing environments or car dealerships, paging into the plant or on the, kind of onto the car lot is something important. And so Algo handles that. There was D10 who brings a whole bunch of devices, Yealink, Neat, QSys, Hudley, Logitech. So there's, obviously the Microsoft ecosystem is an ecosystem where a lot of vendors want to play. So I think that there was a lot of vendors. And what is really good about Comms vNext is because there's this high concentration of deep technical people, lots and lots of Microsoft MVPs, the vendors bring like their really top kind of technical salespeople. So really, there is deep discussions. If you have any really good questions or or detailed questions, this is a really great place to ask, right? So yeah,
So
so
what were
yeah,
the kind of
thanks to all the
topics?
vendors.
What were the kind of topics that came up at the show? I mean, outside the Microsoft community, people are talking about what, another Copilot? What is that, 57 of them? And what's the new name this week as opposed to last week? And some of the other things that are going on. And of course, the requirement for Android versions to switch over to AOSP is, they're really hammering that because they're probably afraid that the announcement's going to get lost in the shuffle of all the Copilot announcements. So they're really reinforcing, hey, this is important. What were the topics amongst the Microsoft community at the show?
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing is there was like what they call 100 level sessions, 200 level sessions, 300 level sessions. The bigger the number, the more detailed it is. Um, I think one of the things like you and I who are steeped in this industry, we forget that um, you know, in just understanding some of the basic stuff. So there was some great sessions. A lady, Sharon Weaver, who ran a great session on prompting, was 100 level session. So she was talking about just like, hey, how do you even start using Copilot, right? So and the same thing within the AV space, which obviously you're deep into, but you know, there was a lot of okay sessions that were okay, how do you get started? And you're thinking about, whatever Microsoft Teams rooms and, but then there was some super deep like Microsoft Teams phone. How do you handle analog devices and SMS and faxing and integrating with on-prem systems? So I think what is great is I don't know that, it wasn't it wasn't taken over by any particular theme. It wasn't like somehow AI was everywhere or contact center was, nothing kind of took over the majority of the show. I think that there was a lot of different themes. And so people that were there could really go and yeah, in some interesting sessions. Tom Arbuthnot, who's a great guy in the Microsoft ecosystem, did a licensing session. And what I really liked about that, there was government people with, talking about GCC and GCC high. These are specialized tenants for government. There was edu customers talking about educational tenants because there's all different flavors. So I think that if you were in the Microsoft ecosystem, which, it's got to be like 90% of larger organizations at least are there, you could go and find important things that were key to you. And I think that that was what I thought was so valuable, about Comms vNext. And that seemed to be the attendees, they could find value in, whatever their key questions were.
So we talked about the sponsors and some of the exhibitors. We talked about the sessions. What was the community like? What were the opportunities and the stories when people were getting together and chatting? How were those events and what were the kind of topics that came up there?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, it is really it is really just this ability to connect with people and really to be authentic. So, there are a lot of people that were, they have, I'm going to say, small to medium-sized businesses, and they might be, kind of leaders in that. So there was, some business discussions about, like, how are you finding this? Because if you're trying to provide value to end users with all of, whether it's the focus on AI or the focus on, whatever the topic is, it can be difficult if you're working hard to serve, not sell. And I had a great conversation with Matt Landis, and one of the things I love about Landis Technologies is if you look at their values, I think their first value is humility, which is relatively unique for an organization, but they really breathe that. And and we were talking about, yeah, how do you get this message out? So there was a lot of conversations from people that were honestly trying to help enterprises sort out all the hype with respect to, AI and figure out, where does Teams make sense and how do you implement it and how do you get the adoption and how do you get the value out of some of this technology that you deployed? So I loved, that was really some conversations that I took the most out of, and people, asked good questions and shared some things that were working for them. So, yeah, that I thought was what was unique about this.
Are there any controversies or any debates that came up?
Um, let's try to think here. I think there's different ideas in terms of um, just kind of where business is. And even the show I was talking to, I called out the key people that are the organizers of the show. And I think overall it's like, well, okay, so how do you provide value to end users? Like, is AI everything, or should we focus more on some of the core kind of better meetings? And, because so I think that there was some interesting discussions as opposed to, let's say, controversies. But with the show itself, I think, you've got Microsoft who's going to, I mean, they're not running it, but there's another Microsoft community event that's happening in Vegas in May. And it's like, Comms vNext is saying, how do we continue to provide value? Do we stick to the Microsoft ecosystem? Do we become more AI, less AI, more contact center, less contact center? How do we continue to provide value? And I think that once again, it wasn't really a controversy, but I think that from the vendors, from the attendees, from the organizers of the event, there was everybody wanted to provide value to each other and to build on the community because I think it's a great event, has great food, by the way. Like they really work hard to provide great food throughout the event. Um, but it is unclear with, increasingly end users have difficulty getting approval for travel to these events. So what do you do to make sure that you can both prove the value and you can kind of keep getting the participants that bring in this richness to the particular event? And I don't know that there was any answers that emerged, but there was a lot of very important conversations, I think.
Yeah, a lot of those questions apply to a lot of the trade shows that are going on right now. And, we're getting together. How much are we going to be spending, and what's happening in the world, which is, the thing that's underlying all of this. Two things happened while you were away at the conference that I think might be of interest that I'd love to get your opinion on. One, I'm not sure if anything was brought up about Microsoft Places at Commons vNext, but while you were there, Microsoft Places did one of its pre-reveals of where they're going and their roadmap. And they were very clear that none of it was under NDA. So I could talk about how they're going to be defining places down to the desk level, which is a change from the way they originally released it, so that you can book individual desks, not just
Right.
arrays of desks. And there were a couple of other things that had come up that, the next iteration of that they expect. They were saying second quarter of this year, which we're kind of in. So I'm hoping to see some of that. Anything about places come up at the conference?
It didn't really come up as a key focus. I mean, I think, what came up more is, um, and I reiterated, and this came out, in Enterprise Connect, this came up several times, which is, Ilya in his keynote at Enterprise Connect said Microsoft is secure, simple, and smart. And I think, when I would retell that story, I said that middle S should be sophisticated, and everybody would agree. And there was lots of discussion around Microsoft is sophisticated. They have lots of enterprise customers. The enterprise customers, if you have hundreds of thousands of users, you make demands of Microsoft. Microsoft adds a feature which adds complexity or sophistication. And so, and this applies to places, this applies to the umpteen versions of Copilot, this applies to their complex licensing. Um, how do you, as Microsoft or as a Microsoft MVP or as a consultant that's trying to help organizations get the most out of Microsoft, how do you even keep up to date with all the changes, whether it's with Places or Copilot or Teams? And that's a significant challenge. I did a session on Copilot Analytics, and I'm going to tell you, I when I volunteered to do it and I started working on the slides in February, it got closer and I went back and I had to redo all of the slides. And because they had introduced significant changes, and it is an overwhelming number of changes. And that's the way that Microsoft approaches things. It's like, when one solution can do, let's create 10 different solutions with 10 different product managers. And
And
it
license them all
is
differently and sell them
license
individually.
them all differently, exactly, and get marketing to change the name every other week, right? So, you know, and how do you deal with this? It's tremendous power. I don't know. I don't want to do the Spider-Man reference, um, but it is sophisticated, and so how do you leverage the sophistication? Because despite apologies, Elia, but it is not simple. It is sophisticated, it is powerful, and it is, and I think everybody wants to leverage that power, but it is challenging, right?
Sure.
So,
Sure. All
um,
right. All right. And then one question that's not necessarily related to Comms v Next, and we'll sort of make this our closing conversation.
sure.
From putting your consultative hat on, a couple of days ago, Zoom had an outage of
Mm,
2 hours. And
yes.
just under 2 hours. And it was not Zoom's fault. There was a problem between their registrar and GoDaddy, and GoDaddy oofed, and they said that they oofed. But the bottom line is, for almost 2 hours, a lot of Zoomies couldn't do their meetings and couldn't answer their phone and couldn't
Yeah.
do things like that. That's probably the worst Zoom outage that I can remember. There might have been one very much earlier on, but I don't remember that. Microsoft has had tons of outages. Cisco had a very famous WebEx outage going back, a number of years ago. So this is not calling out Zoom. This is on it from a question from a user standpoint, from your consultative approach. Should organizations for business continuity have an immediately available backup? Should they be able to operate on more than one platform? I mean, it's a question that's been asked for a really long time, and I don't know that there's a good answer. Is it worth it for 2 hours? Well, it depends. How much business did you lose in 2 hours? And what's it worth to you to not have that gap?
Yeah, so David, I think that this is a great question, and it is absolutely a question that every business leader should be asking, because it is complicated. And so I'm gonna give a plug for on June 4th, Tom Arbuthnot and I, so two of the leading Microsoft gurus, we're gonna do Ribbon is sponsoring. We're going to do this survivability bake-off, and we're going to talk about the survivability options between Cisco, Zoom, and Microsoft. And I think a lot of the conversation, and we haven't created the content yet, but I think a lot of it is saying, look, there's different things that can cause these outages, right? Here was a DNS outage, but that can impact that. You can have an internet outage, you can have a local network outage. And I think that what you want to do, and what I try to do when I put on my consulting hat, is sit down with the leaders, draw kind of a simplified diagram and say, well, if this fails, here's what we can do to prevent that. This is what it would cost. Do we have carrier diversity? Do we bring in multiple SIP trunks? And it's like, okay, here's the cost. You decide if the impact, is worth it. And I think having that discussion where CIOs say, oh, if my office is down, I'll just tell people to work from home. Okay. But in different businesses, that's not an option, right? So I think it's a fantastic question that you asked. I think that there's no generic answer. And if anybody tells you that they have the generic answer, run away because that isn't true, right? The answer requires you to have more, kind of questions and talk about that. But I think that any outage, yes, as you said, Teams has had outages, Cisco's has outages, Zoom, unfortunately had this outage. Um, I think it's like, okay, figure out what that means. Does it mean, do you want to have some other platform? And large organizations sometimes have that additional platform because that makes sense for them. But yeah, definitely, I think it's going to prompt some important discussions that if you haven't talked about business continuity, when you have an outage, that is not the time to figure out your business continuity plan. And
Exactly.
then beyond that, and I think that this is also very important, is when the outage ends, what do you do then? Because a lot of times they say, okay, what do we do when the outage starts? But also when the outage ends, you also have to be able to communicate. How do you know the outage has ended? How do you communicate? Is there a recovery? Did we lose anything? How are we going to recover? And so all of those things, if you haven't had that discussion in your organization, have it now before you have the outage, right?
It was
So,
interesting. My wife works for a healthcare organization, and she said, "Is Zoom down?" And I'd been typing furiously on my computer, and I said, "Yeah, of course Zoom's down." I didn't realize she uses it for her work. She says, "Well, what do I do?" I said, "Well, gee, you're dealing with the healthcare organization, so I can't just throw you one of my other platforms. First of all, you'd show up as me, and second of all,
mm,
I don't think you can handle PII that way. Can you make a phone call?" And she said, "Oh yeah, that's right. I can do up to five people on a conference call on my company iPhone." So it's like, everybody does different things. I know one of the points that Cisco makes is their platform, because they operate Microsoft Teams in a shell, is you can just kind of switch over to WebEx, and that's the backup for if you're using Cisco hardware. So you're right. The time to think about it is now, not when you're having an outage. Number one, and number two, if you happen to be an organization that or a person that for some reason believes that now that you've selected the platform you're doing your calling on, you're done and you never need to work with any of the other platforms. My God, are you misinformed? Everybody needs to communicate across all platforms when a customer or a client or a partner or an emergency in a business continuity situation. You have to know what that strategy is beforehand, not when it first happens. So that's a bit of free advice from two ex-consultants, or current and ex-consultants, or however you want to phrase it.
yep,
Thanks very
yeah,
much.
yeah, well said, David. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, Kevin. I appreciate you being on, and I'm sure I'm going to run into you again at some point later this year for one of the other conferences. Until then, how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin Kieler, LinkedIn. And if I can find the link, and I'm sure I can, once again, June 4th, we're going to talk in more detail about, this bake off, and if you what on whatever platform you've chosen, what the options are and what some additional questions you should be asking about business continuity.
Kevin, thanks very much for joining me for this chat. I guess you need to sign off for BC Strategies, right? You are a leader, as you said. So say goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I mean, I would encourage everybody check out bcstrategies.com. Lots of great content with lots of different opinions, and that is really the strength of this elite group of independent, analysts, consultants, and thought leaders that make up the BC Strategies Expert Group.